Japan's juvenile law was written in 1948. It was built on a simple premise. A child who commits a crime is still a child, and the state's job is to rehabilitate rather than to punish. For decades, that premise held. Then came a run of cases that tested it until it broke. These 5 cases spanned 16 years, and every one of them was committed by someone the law considered a minor. In November 1988, 17-year-old Junko Furuta was abducted in Saitama and held for 44 days in a house in Adachi Ward, Tokyo. Her killers were teenagers. They pleaded guilty not to murder but to inflicting bodily injury resulting in death, and served between roughly 5 and 20 years. One Japanese magazine called the outcome a defeat of the juvenile law. In 1997, a 14-year-old in Kobe left a child's remains at his own school gate with a note signed in an invented name. In 1999, an 18-year-old in Hikari City killed a young mother and her infant daughter, and would eventually become the youngest person sentenced to death in Japan in 66 years. In 2000, a 17-year-old hijacked a highway bus for 15.5 hours after announcing it on a public message board. And in 2004, in a Sasebo classroom, an 11-year-old killed her 12-year-old classmate, too young to be prosecuted at all. Japan amended the law in 2000. These are the cases that forced it. She was 17 years old, cycling home from a part-time job on a November evening in suburban Saitama, a few minutes from her front door. An ordinary Tuesday night in 1988. She never made it home. What happened next unfolded inside a house in Tokyo, over 44 days, beneath the notice of a city of millions. Adults lived in the same building. They heard what was happening. They said nothing. When Junko Furuta's body was finally found, it was encased in concrete inside a steel drum, abandoned in a vacant lot near the bay. The case is considered the worst act of juvenile violence in Japan's post-war history. The 4 teenagers primarily responsible served between 5 and 20 years each. At least 3 of them went on to commit more crimes after their release. This is what happened. Junko Furuta was born on January 18, 1971, and grew up in Misato, Saitama Prefecture. She lived with her parents and 2 brothers and, by every account, was a well-regarded student, good grades, strong attendance, popular with both teachers and classmates. She held a part-time job. She dreamed of becoming an idol singer, the way many teenagers of that era did. On the evening of November 25, 1988, Furuta was cycling home from work when 2 teenagers on motorcycles rode through the area with the deliberate intent to target women. Hiroshi Miyano, 18, and his associate, Shinji Minato, 16, had been circling the neighborhood looking for victims. On Miyano's instruction, Minato rode alongside Furuta and kicked her bicycle out from under her. He then fled. Miyano played the helpful stranger. He rode up as if he'd just happened to witness the attack, expressed concern and offered to walk her home. She had no reason not to trust him. He appeared to be on her side. He was not. After gaining enough of her trust to get her moving, Miyano took her to a nearby warehouse. There, he threatened her. He told her he was connected to the Yakuza and made clear that refusing to cooperate would have consequences for her and her family. Terrified, Furuta complied. She was then taken to the home of Minato's family in the Ayase district of Adachi Ward, Tokyo. That house is where she would remain for the next 44 days. The 4 primary perpetrators, Miyano, Minato, Joe Ogura, 17, and Yasushi Watanabe, 17, subjected Furuta to repeated sexual violence and escalating torture across those weeks. In the early days, the 4 forced her to telephone her parents and tell them she had voluntarily run away from home. She made the call. That single act effectively halted the police investigation for months, because Furuta herself had stated she was fine. Her parents reported her missing, but there was little investigators could do when the missing person had called to say she wasn't. 2 additional participants, Tetsuo Nakamura and Koichi Ihara, both 16, were also later identified as involved. It's said that others were brought to the house over the course of the captivity as well. On January 1, 1989, New Year's Day, Furuta had been held for 37 days. She could no longer stand or move from the floor. On January 4, 1989, the perpetrators beat her with an iron barbell. She was also set on fire. Junko Furuta died that day. She was 17 years old, and it was the 44th day of her captivity. The following evening, the group wrapped her body in a blanket, placed it in a large travel bag, and then into a steel drum. They filled it with wet concrete. That night, they drove to a vacant lot near Wakasu Island in Koto Ward, on the edge of Tokyo Bay, and left the drum there. For months, no one knew where she was. The investigation that eventually broke this case open began with an entirely different crime. In December 1988, just weeks after Furuta's abduction, Miyano and Ogura kidnapped and gang-raped a 19-year-old woman. Both were arrested for that offense in early 1989. During police interrogation, Miyano apparently came to believe that Ogura had already confessed to the Furuta murder, that the investigation had already reached that point. Acting on that mistaken assumption, Miyano disclosed the location of the body himself. He was wrong about what Ogura had said, but his disclosure was enough. On March 30, 1989, investigators located the concrete-filled steel drum in the vacant lot at Wakasu. The concrete had to be broken apart to recover her remains. Junko Furuta had been there for nearly 3 months. From there, the full scope of what had happened inside the Minato house emerged through interrogation. One element of the captivity has continued to disturb people ever since. Minato's parents lived in the building where Furuta was held, directly above where she was kept. According to testimony that emerged in the investigation, they were aware, at least in part, of what was happening in their own home. Multiple accounts indicate that Miyano had extended his threats beyond the immediate group, warning Minato's family of what would happen to them if they contacted police. The parents said nothing for 44 days. Their son's home was the crime scene, and they lived upstairs. Furuta reportedly made at least one attempt to reach out to a neighbor. It came to nothing. The question of why requires starting with the person who built the conditions for it. Hiroshi Miyano was 18 at the time of the abduction and was already a known delinquent in the Ayase area. Someone with an established reputation for violence and, it said, connections to criminal networks, possibly adjacent to organized crime. The precise nature of any Yakuza ties was never officially established in court records. What is clearly established is that Miyano commanded genuine fear from those around him. The other perpetrators deferred to him. The family in the building did not call police because they were reportedly afraid of the consequences. Others who came to the house during the captivity appear also to have been afraid to refuse or to speak to authorities afterward. That architecture of fear explains how 44 days became possible. Miyano's capacity to intimidate created concentric rings of silence. The other perpetrators, the family upstairs, the neighbors, the people who came and left. For the 3 perpetrators other than Miyano, what held them in place appears to have been a combination of coercion and deepening complicity. Once they had participated in the initial crimes, going to police meant exposing themselves. Every passing day added to the weight of what they had already done and made the prospect of stopping feel more dangerous than continuing. This doesn't excuse their choices. They made active decisions every day across those 44 days. But it explains how the situation held together. There is also a structural factor that loomed over the aftermath. Japan's juvenile law as it existed in 1988 imposed meaningful ceilings on punishment for anyone under 20. It's been reported, though this is not confirmed from any official record, that Miyano was aware of how the juvenile system operated and understood that his youth offered some degree of protection. Whether that calculation was ever explicit in his thinking cannot be verified. But the public debate that followed the case kept returning to it, because it raised a harder question. What happens when the system's own protections become a resource for those who exploit them? Let me be clear, as I always am in this section, nothing here is a clinical diagnosis. What follows is interpretive commentary, based on testimony, journalism, and the criminological analysis this case has generated over more than 3 decades. What the Furuta case illustrates, psychologically, is one of the clearest real-world examples of what researchers call de-individuation, the process by which individual moral identity gets submerged within a group context. Studies of group violence consistently find that people participate in acts under collective conditions that they would almost certainly refuse alone. The mechanism is well understood. Shared participation distributes guilt. An authority figure grants permission, and each incremental escalation makes the next one feel less transgressive than it should. Miyano is the pivot point. He was not simply the oldest, he was the established authority, the source of both permission and threat. For the other perpetrators, his presence appears to have performed two functions simultaneously. It authorized the violence, and it made dissent feel more dangerous than participation. That double bind is extremely effective at sustaining group behavior far past the point where individual conscience would otherwise stop it. There's also the escalation dynamic. The violence Furuta endured was not a single act, but a process, unfolding across 44 days. And processes have an internal logic. Once committed to the initial crimes, the internal incentives for the perpetrators all push toward continuation rather than withdrawal. This is why these situations are so difficult to interrupt from within. What's also significant about this case is the failure of the rings outside the perpetrators themselves. Minato's parents, the people who visited the house, the neighbor. Each of these was a moment when someone outside the core group could have intervened and didn't. The common thread appears to have been Miyano's capacity to create fear that extended well beyond the people directly involved. In a social environment where his threats were believable, ordinary self-interest repeatedly overrode the impulse to act. And at the center of all of it was a 17-year-old girl who, according to accounts that emerged later, still believed at points during the captivity that she might be released. She cooperated when forced to. She prayed. She endured what was happening to her day by day in a city of millions, in a house where adults lived upstairs, heard everything, and chose silence. The trial took place in 1990. All four primary defendants pleaded guilty, but not to murder. The charge was inflicting bodily injury resulting in death, a distinction that significantly constrained the available sentences under Japan's juvenile justice framework. Miyano received 17 years, increased to 20 on appeal. Ogura received approximately 8 years. Minato received between 5 and 9 years. Watanabe received between 5 and 7 years. The public response in Japan was a wave of sustained specific outrage. Petitions circulated, editorials called for the system to change. The Japanese magazine Shukan Shincho, after tracking the subsequent arrests of multiple perpetrators, called the outcome a defeat of the juvenile law. Those subsequent crimes arrived in the years following release. Ogura was arrested in 1999 for assault and unlawful confinement of a woman, and again in 2004 for attempted murder. Minato was arrested in 2018, 30 years after the murder, for an alleged street attack on a man with a metal baton and knife during a parking dispute. He was convicted in 2019 and received a 1-year 6-month sentence, suspended with probation. Miyano was reportedly arrested in 2013 in connection with a phone fraud scheme targeting elderly victims, though the full details of that case were not made widely public. Watanabe, the youngest of the primary perpetrators at the time of sentencing, died in May 2021 at the age of 49. The Furuta case was one of several high-profile juvenile crimes in Japan during the late 1980s and 1990s that together pushed the country toward significant legal reform. Japan's year 2000 revisions to the juvenile law lowered the minimum age at which serious offenders could be prosecuted in adult courts and expanded the grounds for transferring juvenile cases from family court to criminal court. Those reforms have continued to be amended since, and the question of how the legal system should respond to severe violence by young offenders remains genuinely contested in Japan. None of it brought Junko Furuta home. What stays with me thinking about this case is not just the violence, it's the number of moments when it could have been stopped. The adults in the building, the neighbors, the people who came to the house and walked away without calling anyone. 44 days, and within each day, multiple choices made by multiple people. Ordinary fear. Fear of a teenager, fear of confrontation, fear of what exposure might cost, was enough to keep a city from saving one person. Her name was Junko Furuta. She was 17 years old. She had good grades, people who loved her, and plans for her life. She deserved to get home that November night. Thank you for watching. If you want to understand more about the cases that shaped Japan's legal history, subscribe and stay with us. These stories are worth understanding. On the morning of May 27, 1997, teachers and students arriving at Tomogaoka Junior High School in Kobe found something waiting for them at the school gate. Something that would stop an entire nation cold. There, placed with apparent deliberateness, was the severed head of an 11-year-old boy. Stuffed in his mouth was a handwritten note signed with a name no one recognized. Saito Sakakibara. The note promised that this was only the beginning. Japan had not seen anything like it. The person who left that note, who had committed these crimes, was not a shadowed adult with a long criminal history. He was a 14-year-old junior high school student. He attended the very school whose gate he had chosen for this display. This is the Kobe child murders, and decades later it remains one of the most disturbing cases in modern Japanese history. The crimes unfolded across Suma Ward, a quiet residential neighborhood on the western edge of Kobe, over roughly 4 months in 1997. The first attacks came on February the 10th. 2 elementary schoolgirls, both around 10 years old, were struck from behind with a hammer while walking in the neighborhood. Both survived, badly shaken. At the time, there was no obvious connection to anything larger. Then, on March 16th, a 10-year-old girl named Ayaka Yamashita was walking near her home when she was attacked from behind. Again, a hammer to the back of the head. The blow was severe. She was rushed to hospital. For 12 days, her family waited. On March 27th, Ayaka died of her injuries. She was in the 4th grade. Suma Ward was frightened. Parents walked their children to school. Police were investigating. But the picture was still incomplete. Then, in late May, an 11-year-old boy named Jun Haza went missing. Jun was a student at Tainohata Elementary School, a cheerful child who attended special education classes. He disappeared without a trace. He was found, or rather, part of him was found, on May 27th, his head placed at the gate of Tomogaoka Junior High School. He had been strangled and then decapitated. The note in his mouth was written in red pen and signed Sakakibara. It was addressed to police. It was taunting. It described what had been done with what appeared to be satisfaction, and it warned that more would follow. The national press descended on Kobe, but the investigation was already shifting. On June 6th, a letter arrived at the Kobe Shimbun newspaper. This one was signed Oniboshi, Demon Star. It contained details of Junhase's murder that had never been made public. Details that only the killer could know. The letter spoke of pleasure taken in the killing and referred to children as vegetables, 3 of whom, it threatened, would be killed each week. The terror was real. And then, in mid-June, the investigation made a break. Investigators, through painstaking cross-referencing of witness accounts, physical evidence, and the geography of the attacks, narrowed their focus to a single neighborhood in Suma Ward, to a specific address. On June 28, 1997, police arrived at the home of a junior high school student. He was 14 years old. His name was Shinichiro Azuma. He confessed the same day. Physical evidence found at Azuma's home confirmed what he had confessed to. He was the one who had attacked the children in Suma Ward. Handwriting analysis linked him to both the note found with Jun Haza and the letter sent to the newspaper. Evidence from the crime scenes matched. What emerged from the investigation was not a picture of sudden, uncontrolled rage. The attacks had escalated steadily. The early hammer attacks in February were, in a terrible sense, practice. The murder of Ayaka Yamashita in March marked an escalation. And the killing of Jun Haza, planned to include a message, a signature, a calculated staging, represented something further still, a deliberate performance. Azuma had selected Tomogaoka Junior High School's gate because he knew it. He was enrolled there. He placed Junhase's remains at his own school, not out of carelessness, but apparently as a statement, a way of ensuring maximum impact, maximum visibility. The note was written in advance. The alias, Saito Sakakibara, a name he had constructed with care, was ready to go. He sent the second letter to a newspaper, not in a panic, but apparently to amplify the story, to make sure the audience was paying attention. In his confession and the subsequent psychiatric evaluation, Azuma described his actions with a detachment that investigators found deeply unsettling. He spoke of the killings not as something that had overwhelmed him, but as something he had pursued. Azuma came from what appeared, outwardly, to be a stable home. He was the eldest son in a family in Suma Ward. He attended school, had no obvious criminal record, and was not known to teachers or neighbors as a violent child. But the picture that emerged in the psychiatric evaluation told a different story. When Azuma was around 11 years old, in 1993, it said, his grandmother died. She had been, by most accounts, the warmest person in his life, the one family member who provided him with something like unconditional warmth. She was gone, and according to the psychiatric report, it said that the relationship between Azuma and his mother had always been difficult, characterized by poor attachment. The evaluation noted explicitly that the attachment relationship with his mother was very poor and that psychological intervention was necessary. After his grandmother's death, something shifted. He became, it is reported, fixated on the concept of death itself, not in grief exactly, but in something colder, a need to understand what death was. He started dissecting frogs and snails, then other animals. By his mid-teens, it said he had killed at least 20 cats, though the full details of this come primarily from his own account and secondary sources rather than formally verified court records. One account describes him lining up frogs in a row and riding over them with his bicycle. By 1995, he was already receiving psychiatric treatment. He had been diagnosed with ADHD. Those around him described him as quiet, not obviously troubled, not flagged as dangerous, just withdrawn, closed off. What the letters suggest, and what he described in the years afterward, is a deep, corroding conviction that he did not exist in any meaningful way to the people around him. That school, that society, that the adults in his world had looked straight through him. It is reported that he described feeling like what he called a transparent existence, present in the room but registered by no one. The killings and the letters were in this reading a violent refusal of that invisibility. A declaration, if no one had seen him, they would see Saito Sakakibara now. This is interpretive, not a clinical assessment, and nothing here should be read as a diagnosis. But looking at what the evaluations found and what the evidence suggests, a picture does take shape. The psychiatric examination determined that Azuma had conduct disorder, with some symptoms of depersonalization and dissociation. These were real, the evaluators concluded, but they were not severe enough to amount to diminished responsibility. He understood what he was doing. He knew it was wrong. Later, some psychiatrists, and this is disputed, not a consensus view, have suggested the profile is consistent with what was then called Asperger's disorder, now part of autism spectrum disorder. The argument is that his difficulty forming emotional connections, his intense narrow fixation on the concept of death, and what appears to have been a genuine inability to register other human beings as fully real to him, are consistent with that profile. But I want to be clear, this is contested, and it doesn't resolve the question of responsibility. What the evidence does show clearly is a years-long progression that no one around him caught, or if they caught it, didn't act on in time. The animal cruelty is not incidental. It is a well-documented precursor in cases like this, a process of testing and extending what it feels like to cross a line, to take life and feel nothing. It escalated for years before it reached people. There is also something important in the performance of the crimes, the alias, the letters, the careful placement. This was not someone who acted and then fled in panic. It was someone who had constructed an identity for these acts, a theatrical persona. The murders were, in some sense, staged, which means that somewhere underneath the detachment there was a need for an audience. A need, perhaps, for the world to finally acknowledge that he existed. That is the most disturbing thing about this case. Not the horror of the crimes themselves, though they are truly horrible, but the gap between the silent, invisible boy in the classroom and the person who carefully wrote those letters and staged that display. Those two people occupied the same body, and in the space between them, two children lost their lives. Because Azuma was 14 at the time of the crimes, Japan's juvenile law as it stood in 1997 did not allow him to be tried as an adult. He was not sent to prison. Instead, on October 13, 1997, he was committed to the Kanto Medical Juvenile Training School, a psychiatric detention facility, to receive treatment under indefinite supervision. On March 11, 2004, the Ministry of Justice announced his provisional release. He was 21 years old. Full release followed on January 1, 2005. The case changed Japan in concrete ways. In 2000, the country amended its juvenile law, lowering the minimum age at which a minor could be referred for trial as an adult from 16 to 14. It was a direct response to this case. The broader debate about whether the system should prioritize punishment or rehabilitation for young offenders has never fully settled and probably never will. In June 2015, Azuma published an autobiography. It was titled Zeka, roughly translatable as absolute verse or extreme song. In it, he wrote about the murders with what he described as remorse. But there were passages that struck many readers, including the victims' families, as expressing something more ambiguous, something closer to pride or to nostalgia than to grief. The book reached the top of Japanese bestseller lists. One bookstore chain refused to stock it. Junha's family had tried to block its release. They failed. Azuma's father, to his credit, responded differently. He wrote his own book, titled, with painful directness, Boy A, Birthing This Child, and donated all proceeds to one of the victims' families. His parents divorced after the arrest. His father left Kobe and changed his name. There is, in that, something worth noting. A parent trying to account for what his child had done. What this case leaves behind is difficult to face without flinching. 2 children, Ayaka Yamashita and Jun Hase, are dead. They were 10 and 11 years old. 3 other children were attacked and injured. A neighborhood had to teach its children that walking to school was not safe. And the person who did this has been free for over 20 years. There are no clean answers here, but there are warning signs that were present and missed and worth naming. Years of cruelty to animals, a child who had closed himself off from human connection, a grief that was never worked through, a hatred that was allowed to calcify in silence. Understanding doesn't excuse, but it does, sometimes, allow us to see the damage before it becomes irreversible. And that, at least, is worth something. Thank you for watching. If this case stayed with you, subscribe, because these stories deserve to be understood, not just remembered. April 14, 1999. A young mother is home alone with her baby daughter in Hikari City, a small coastal town in Yamaguchi Prefecture at the western tip of Japan's main island. Her husband left for work that morning, the same way he always did. She has no reason to think today is anything other than an ordinary Thursday. There is a knock at the door. The man outside says he's there to check the plumbing. She lets him in. In the next few minutes, Yayoi Motomura, 23 years old, with an 11-month-old daughter named Yuka, will be murdered in her own home. Her baby will be murdered too, and the case that follows will drag on for 13 years, forcing Japan to ask a question it had never fully answered before. Can a teenager, a person not yet considered a legal adult, be put to death for something this terrible? This is the story of the Hikari mother-child murder. Hiroshi Motomura was 32 years old and worked at a factory in the area. He and his wife Yayoi lived in a modest apartment in company-provided housing in Hikari City with their infant daughter. On the morning of April 14, 1999, Hiroshi left for work as usual. When he came home, he found something no one should ever have to find. Yayoi, 23 years old, was dead. So was their daughter Yuka, 11 months old. Their bodies had been hidden inside a closet. Yayoi had been strangled. Yuka had been strangled. There were signs of sexual assault on Yayoi's body. Her purse had been stolen. Police moved quickly. Living in the same company housing complex just nearby was an 18-year-old neighbor named Takayuki Fukuda. He was arrested within days. 2 victims, a mother, a baby not yet a year old. Both killed in the same apartment on the same afternoon by the same person, a young man who had lived close enough to know their faces. What happened in that apartment and how and why would take more than a decade to fully resolve in court. Fukuda's method for getting through the front door was simple and calculated. He knocked and told Yayoi he was there to inspect the drainage pipes. Routine building maintenance, the kind of visit you don't question, especially in company housing where management can send someone over any time. There was nothing about the request that would have raised alarm. Yayoi opened the door. Once inside, he attacked her sexually. She resisted him, and when she fought back, he strangled her with his hands until she was dead. Then baby Yuka, 11 months old, unable to understand anything happening around her, began to cry. She wouldn't stop, so Fukuda strangled her too, with a cord. He then committed necrophilia on Yayoi's body. He took her purse, and he hid both bodies, the mother and her infant daughter, inside the closet, before walking out of the apartment and returning to his own. He was back home when Hiroshi Motomura arrived from work. The whole sequence, the knock, the attack, the killings, the theft, the hiding of the bodies, happened in the hours of a single afternoon. Yayoi and Yuka Motomura were gone before Hiroshi knew anything was wrong. The question of motive here is complicated, partly because of what Fukuda's life before April 1999 reportedly looked like, and partly because some of what was later offered as an explanation for his behavior came from a defense team that Japan came to deeply distrust. So let's start with what is reported about his background. It's said that Fukuda grew up in a household marked by violence, that his father regularly beat his wife and his children. When Fukuda was 12 years old, his mother took her own life. By all accounts, this devastated him. He reportedly grew up in the years after that, with deepening anger and isolation, and it's said he began committing petty crimes with other troubled teenagers as a teenager, his antisocial tendencies becoming more pronounced over time. None of this comes from a court verdict. It comes from reporting on his life. I am telling you it the way it was reported, not the way it was proven. What the courts established as fact is the stated motive, which was more direct and more brutal. Fukuda went to Yayoi Motomura's door intending to rape her. When she resisted, he killed her. When her daughter wouldn't stop crying, he killed her too. He stole what he could. He left. That's what the courts accepted. What came later in the appeals was a very different version, one that Japan found far harder to accept. To understand this case fully, you have to understand what happened during the retrial proceedings, because the defense strategy Fukuda's lawyers deployed became one of the most controversial episodes in modern Japanese legal history. When Fukuda was initially sentenced to life in prison, his defense team launched an appeal, and somewhere between the first verdict and the retrial, the defense, which included a prominent lawyer named Yoshihiro Yasuda, developed a completely new framework for the crime. They argued that the killings were not premeditated murder in the traditional sense. And then, for the most disturbing element of the case, the necrophilia, the defense reportedly argued something extraordinary: that Fukuda's actions after Yayoi died were not a further violation of her body, but an expression of a desperate desire to bring her back to life. It said the defense claimed he had been overwhelmed by a longing for his dead mother, and that when he saw Yayoi, a young woman, a mother herself, something in him fractured, and the necrophilia was a kind of frantic, confused attempt at resurrection. The court rejected every part of this. The Hiroshima High Court, in its 2008 retrial ruling, noted that Fukuda had expressed falsehoods during the proceedings, and that there were therefore no mitigating circumstances. His behavior in court, the judges found, had actually demonstrated a lack of genuine remorse rather than an abundance of it. But the public had been watching, and the reaction to the defense's strategy was staggering. It is said that approximately 7,000 disciplinary complaints were filed against the defense lawyers with bar associations across Japan. 7,000. The Japanese Bar Association reviewed them and rejected all of them. No lawyer faced any disciplinary action. This is a legal and ethical debate that isn't fully resolved. Some legal scholars argue that lawyers are obligated to mount the most vigorous defense possible for their clients, however unpopular that defense may be. Others felt the maternal longing and resurrection arguments crossed a line, that they re-traumatized Hiroshi Motomura and showed contempt for the gravity of what his wife and daughter had suffered. What I can say about Fukuda is this: whatever the defense lawyers argued, the pattern of his actions suggests someone who, by 18, had already learned to treat other people as objects he could use and discard. He used Yayoi's home as if it were accessible to him. He used her body. He used her baby's death as a solution to an inconvenience. And then he went home. The relationship between a childhood soaked in violence, the loss of a mother at 12, and the person who knocked on that door in 1999, that relationship is real, even if it explains nothing and excuses nothing. Millions of people endure terrible childhoods. Very few of them do what he did. But the pattern of what shapes people toward violence, the absence of safety, the absence of attachment, the normalization of harm, is worth taking seriously, not to generate sympathy, but because understanding it is the only way any of this becomes preventable. The legal road in this case was extraordinary in its length. The Yamaguchi District Court sentenced Fukuda to life in prison in 2000, citing his youth as a factor in sparing him from the death penalty. The Hiroshima High Court upheld that sentence in 2002. And then, in 2006, Japan's Supreme Court did something significant. It quashed the High Court ruling and sent the case back for a fresh hearing. The justices said explicitly that a perpetrator's age cannot be considered a definitive factor in avoiding the death penalty. That was a statement with weight, because it pushed the courts to reckon with the crime itself, not just the age of the person who committed it. When the Hiroshima High Court retried the case in April 2008, it imposed death. On February 20, 2012, Japan's Supreme Court upheld that sentence. Takayuki Fukuda became the youngest person sentenced to death in Japan in 66 years. But the other story inside this case, the one that will outlast the verdict, is the story of Hiroshi Motomura. The man who came home to find his wife and daughter murdered in a closet could have retreated into grief. Instead, he became one of Japan's most visible advocates for crime victims' rights. He spoke publicly and repeatedly about how the legal system had been built entirely around the accused, with the families of victims left in the hallway. Sometimes literally, because families weren't even guaranteed a seat in the courtroom at the trial of the person who killed their loved ones. He helped form the National Crime Victims Association. He campaigned for the right of bereaved families to be present during proceedings, to make statements, to bring photographs, so that Yayoi and Yuka Motomura could be in the room as people, not just as case numbers. He succeeded. Japan's laws were amended. Victims' families can now attend court hearings for violent crimes. Portraits can be brought into the courtroom. The reforms that followed, both to victim participation rules and to the Juvenile Act, which was revised in 2001 for the first time in 52 years, lowering the punishable age from 16 to 14, were shaped in part by what happened to his family. None of it gives him back what was taken. Nothing does. But in a system that once made the bereaved invisible, Hiroshi Motomura refused to disappear. He made sure that Yayoi and Yuka weren't forgotten, not by the courts, not by the public, not by anyone who followed the case. As for Fukuda, it is said that he has applied for a retrial. As of now, no retrial has been granted. Whatever happens legally, one thing doesn't change. On an ordinary Thursday in April 1999, a woman opened her door in good faith. Her daughter was 11 months old. Neither of them made it to the evening. They were real. They mattered. And we should say so. Thank you for watching. If this case makes you think about justice and who it's actually built for, subscribe and stay with us. There's more to come. It's Golden Week in Japan, the biggest national holiday stretch of the year. Millions of people are traveling, the highways are full, and on a Nishitetsu express bus rolling out of Saga at lunchtime on May 3, 2000, there are 21 passengers who have no reason to think this will be anything other than a routine 40-minute ride to Fukuoka. They would not arrive in Fukuoka for 15.5 hours. And here is the thing that set this case apart from every Japanese hijacking that came before it. 1 hour before a 17-year-old boy pulled out a kitchen knife and seized control of that bus, he told the internet exactly what he was about to do. He posted it on a public message board under the alias Neo Mujika, Neo Barley Tea. The people who read it laughed at him. They told him he was lying. He wasn't. This is the Neo Mujicha bus hijacking. May 3, 2000, the Nishitetsu Wakakusu Go Highway Express bus departs Saga Station at 12:56 in the afternoon, heading for Fukuoka's Tenjin district. Routine route, ordinary day. At roughly 1:35 p.m., near the Dazaifu interchange on the Kyushu Expressway, a teenager in one of the rear seats stands up. He is 17 years old, from Saga Prefecture, and he has a chef's knife in his hand. He walks to the front of the bus and presses the blade against the driver. The driver has no choice. The bus does not turn toward Fukuoka. What follows is one of the strangest and most harrowing ordeals in modern Japanese criminal history. For the next 15-plus hours, the bus rolls through northern Kyushu and then across the Kanmon Strait into Honshu, moving through Yamaguchi and into Hiroshima Prefecture, covering roughly 320 kilometers with a teenager and a knife and 21 passengers trapped inside. During the early part of the hijacking, the boy attacks passengers with the knife. He stabs 3 women. One of them, a passenger who cannot be moved to safety, later dies in hospital from her wounds. 2 more passengers are so desperate to escape that they jump from the moving vehicle. They survive but are injured in the fall. A 40-year-old woman manages to escape the bus around 2:47 in the afternoon. She is the first to alert police, and from that moment, law enforcement is tracking the bus across 2 prefectures. By nightfall, Japan is watching. News cameras follow the bus. Negotiators make contact by phone. The driver keeps driving because he is told to. The remaining hostages sit and wait. It is not until the early morning hours of May 4th, close to 5 a.m., that the bus finally stops. It pulls into the Koya service area on the Sanyo Expressway in Higashi, Hiroshima. There, members of Japan's Special Assault Team, the SAT, drawn from both the Osaka and Fukuoka prefectural police, storm the bus. The teenager is overpowered and arrested. The hostage-taking is over. It has lasted 15 hours and 30 minutes. 1 woman is dead. Several others have been harmed, and Japan wakes up to a case unlike anything it had seen before. The boy, whose alias became the name of the whole case, had been planning this for days, and the weeks and months before the hijacking tell a story of someone who had been quietly unraveling for a long time. His real name, later widely reported in Japanese media, is Taniguchi Seiichi. He was born in March 1983 in Saga Prefecture. His father worked as a salaryman for a construction machinery company. His mother was a public health nurse for the local government. He had a younger sister. By early accounts, he was a bright and energetic child, academically strong through elementary and junior high school, known for being active and in those early years good-natured. But something changed during his junior high school years. He was bullied. Not a minor episode, persistent enough that by the time he was a teenager, he had essentially stopped going out. He became housebound, and the pressure that had nowhere to go began to surface inside the family home, where it said he started showing violence toward family members. His parents tried to get help. They brought him to a psychiatrist, and in the months before the hijacking, he had been briefly admitted to a psychiatric facility. He was on temporary release, what in Japan is called jia tui yuan, a conditional discharge, when May 3rd arrived. That morning, he told his parents he was going cycling in the forest. Instead, he went to Saga Station. He got on the Wakakusugo Express bus as an ordinary passenger. An hour before he pulled out the knife, he posted on the internet forum 2channel, already in 2000 one of the most visited sites in Japan. His handle was Neomugicha. Neomugicha. He had been active on the forum, and he had already posted hints about what he intended. But the tone of those posts was sardonic enough, cryptic enough, that 2channel's regular users saw them and reacted with derision. Some responded that he was a liar, some mocked him. The idea that someone would actually do what he was describing, that was real and happening right now, didn't register. He had also reportedly posted on the eve of the incident, May 2nd, one line that has been widely quoted in Japanese coverage: "Mother, they told me I have no presence." A comment about feeling invisible, about mattering to no one. Then he boarded the bus, took his seat, and waited. The question of motive is complicated because Taniguchi himself gave different accounts over time, and because Japanese courts handled the case primarily through the lens of mental health rather than criminal responsibility. but the shape of what drove him is legible. He had initially planned, it is said, to return to his middle school, the school where the bullying had happened, and attack people there. A revenge fantasy that had been building for months or years. According to what was later reported, he changed the plan because Golden Week meant the school would be empty. The bus was, in some sense, a substitute, a target of opportunity, a crowd of strangers who became stand-ins for a world that had ignored and diminished him. His mother had told professionals she was frightened of him at home. His parents had tried to intervene through mental health channels. It's alleged that the family knew something was wrong, that this was not ordinary adolescent difficult behavior, but something more serious, and that the system they turned to did not prevent what was coming. The post about having no presence is telling. Bullying in Japan is not always physical. Often its cruelest form is social erasure, being treated as if you do not exist, being excluded from conversations, from groups, from basic acknowledgement. For a child who had once been academically strong and socially visible, the experience of being rendered invisible by peers may have created a wound that festered without treatment. Taniguchi had been diagnosed, informally at the time, with what was described as a mild mental disorder. After the hijacking, the court-ordered psychiatric evaluation found symptoms consistent with dissociative disorder and conduct disorder. These are not small things. They suggest a person whose grip on his own identity and on external reality was already fragile before May 3rd ever arrived. And then there is the two-channel element. He posted publicly. He wanted to be seen. He wanted someone to know what was happening, either to stop him or to witness him. Like other perpetrators in this era of Japanese crime, there was an audience dimension to what he did. The act itself was not enough. It had to be announced, broadcast, acknowledged. The internet gave him that capacity for the first time, and he used it. This is interpretive territory, not a clinical assessment, but an attempt to understand the human being behind the act. What strikes many people who have studied this case is the combination of visibility and invisibility that defined Taniguchi's adolescence. He had been a child who succeeded, who was seen, and then bullying stripped that away. What replaced it was not simply sadness or social withdrawal, it was rage, directed initially inward, the isolation, the refusal to leave the house, and then outward, the family violence, and ultimately the hijacking. The online element matters here beyond just the two-channel posts. Anonymous internet forums offered something that his offline life had closed off to him, a space where he could exist, where his words could be read, where he could be somebody. He wasn't alone in that experience. In 2000, Japan's internet was still relatively new as a mass phenomenon, and for young people who felt marginal in real social life, these anonymous spaces were sometimes the only place where a sense of self could be maintained. When he told the forum what he was going to do and was laughed at, it is possible that the mockery hardened something, that being disbelieved in that space too was a final indignity. The psychiatric findings of dissociative disorder and conduct disorder point to a fragmented relationship with self and with others. Dissociation, in particular, can blur the boundary between fantasy and action, between imagined scenarios and real ones. It may help explain how someone who seems, by his early biography, to have been a normal, bright child could reach a point where stabbing strangers on a bus felt like a coherent response to his pain. Survivor Yamaguchi Yumiko, one of the passengers injured during the hijacking, later became a human rights advocate for youth struggling with adjustment. According to what has been reported, she visited Taniguchi while he was still in the reform facility around 2005. He knelt before her and apologized in tears. Whatever that encounter meant to each of them, it doesn't undo what happened. But it does suggest that the teenager who boarded the Wakakusu Go bus was not someone who felt nothing. That somewhere under the violence there was a person who knew at some level the weight of what he had done. That doesn't make what happened forgivable. It doesn't make the woman who died any less dead. But it does complicate the clean narrative of the monster, and that complication, sitting uncomfortably alongside the grief of the victims, is closer to the truth. Taniguchi Seiichi was not criminally prosecuted. He was 17, and Japanese juvenile law at the time treated underage offenders differently from adults. In September 2000, the Saga family court decided against criminal punishment, citing the psychiatric findings and recommending medical intervention. He was sent to the Kyoto Medical Juvenile Detention Center, a medical reform facility, and underwent a structured rehabilitation program there for just over 5 years. He was conditionally released in January 2006. The case had consequences far beyond one teenager. It landed in the middle of a wave of high-profile juvenile crimes in Japan. The Kobe child murders of 1997, the Ikebukuro and Shimonoseki rampages of 1999, and it accelerated a conversation the country had been avoiding. Were the laws written in 1948 still adequate? The answer, in November 2000, was no. Japan revised the Juvenile Act that same year, effective April 2001, lowering the minimum age for criminal punishment from 16 to 14. It was a significant shift, and the Neo Mujika case was explicitly part of the political pressure behind it. And the internet dimension reverberated too. Japanese police began monitoring 2channel for credible threats after the hijacking. The forum's own culture changed. Users who had mocked Neo Mujika as a liar were shaken when they understood the posts had been real. Over the following years, copycat plotters who announced intentions online were identified and arrested before they could act. This case, in a real sense, wrote the first rough draft of how Japan would handle online threats going forward. But maybe the most unusual piece of the aftermath is also the most human. A survivor's decision to go and meet the person who had hurt her, and a young man's tears of apology. That encounter doesn't balance any ledger, but it signals that something that looked at first like pure senseless violence had, underneath it, the wreckage of a human being who had been failed at multiple points along the way. By peers, by systems, and perhaps by an internet that amplified his despair while mocking it. If there's a lesson here that travels, it isn't that all troubled teenagers are dangerous or that anonymous forums are inherently evil. It's that the warning signs were there and legible. He posted them. He said in plain sight, "I have no presence, no one sees me. I'm going to make them see me now. Thanks for watching. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, because these cases are about more than what went wrong. They're about all the moments before where something could have gone right." June 1st, 2004. Lunchtime at a primary school in Sasebo, a port city in Nagasaki Prefecture. An 11-year-old girl asks her classmate to come with her to an empty room down the hall. The classmate is 12. She trusts her. She says yes. Minutes later, a teacher finds the 11-year-old standing in the corridor, alone, soaked in blood. "I did a very bad thing," the girl says quietly. She doesn't run. She doesn't cry. She doesn't make excuses. She just stands there and confesses. What happened in that empty classroom would shock Japan to its core. Not because it was the work of a hardened criminal, but because the person who did it was a child. An ordinary-seeming child who had been coming apart, quietly and invisibly, for months. And the thing that set it off was a few lines of text in an online chat room. And then the internet got involved, and the story got stranger still. It was a Tuesday in early summer. At Okubo Elementary School in Higashiokubocho, Sasebo, 6th graders were finishing their lunch. Satomi Mitarai was 12 years old and in the same class as the girl who would kill her. They knew each other well. They had spent time together, shared a digital presence on the social sites popular among Japanese schoolchildren at the time. During the lunch break, Girl A, as the perpetrator is legally referred to under Japan's strict juvenile privacy laws, approached Satomi and asked if she'd come with her to a study room further down the building. There was no reason for Satomi to refuse. She went. The study room was empty. Girl A closed the curtains. She had a box cutter, the kind used in Japanese classrooms for craft projects, slim and ordinary. She told Satomi to sit down. Then she moved behind her and slashed her throat. The wound was deep. Reports describe a laceration nearly 10 centimeters wide, drawn across the throat from left to right. Satomi tried to fight back. She flailed her arms desperately, trying to make Girl A stop. But Girl A kept cutting at Satomi's wrists and forearms. And according to investigators, she waited long enough to be sure Satomi wasn't getting up before she walked out of the room. Satomi Mitarai was 12 years old. She did not survive. Girl A walked back down the corridor. She was covered in blood. A teacher stopped her immediately. And this is the part that haunts people. She didn't run, didn't lie, didn't try to explain it away as an accident. She looked at her teacher and said she had done a very bad thing. Police arrived and took her in. She was cooperative throughout. She confirmed what she had done. She told investigators she had planned it. She had thought about it in advance, she said, and she chose the box cutter specifically because she believed it was reliable. That word, planned, is what made the case impossible to dismiss as a moment of panic. This was premeditated by an 11-year-old. The roots of the conflict were online, and they dated back only days before the murder. In late May 2004, a friction had developed between the two girls on Cafesta, a popular Japanese social networking site of that era, something like a personal homepage crossed with a chat room, widely used among middle school-aged children. What exactly was written is a matter of differing accounts, but the core of it is this. Satomi had made mocking comments about Girl A online. She reportedly called her a buriko, a Japanese term for someone who puts on an exaggerated fake air of cuteness or innocence. Calling someone a buriko is essentially calling them a phony. It said there were also comments, either by Satomi or by others in their group, mocking Girl A's appearance and weight. These weren't posted privately. They were there for classmates to read. Girl A had not let it pass. She reportedly broke into Satomi's personal website and defaced it. And her behavior at school had been escalating in ways that, in hindsight, were clear warning signs, punching and kicking classmates, and, this detail is significant, she had reportedly brought a knife to school a full month before the murder. Teachers and classmates had noticed the behavior. Whether anyone understood what it might be building toward is another question. At home, according to accounts from school officials, she was under pressure. Her parents had pulled her off the school basketball team, something she was reportedly passionate about, to force her to focus on academic study. Whether this contributed to her deteriorating state of mind is debated, but it removed the one structured outlet she had. Girl A was also, it emerged after the fact, deeply drawn to dark and violent media. She maintained a personal website that was dedicated to horror content. She was a fan of The Red Room, a Japanese flash animation horror clip that was circulating widely among schoolchildren in 2004, a creepypasta-style story in which a voice asks if you've seen The Red Room. She had read the novel Battle Royale and seen its film adaptation, a story in which middle schoolers are sent to an island and forced to kill each other for the entertainment of the state. The presiding judge in her case would later say that she had ballooned her aggressive ego, affected by horror novels she had immersed herself in. That's a strong interpretation. Violent media doesn't by itself turn a child into a killer, and that claim should be held lightly. But the picture that emerges is of a girl who was already deeply immersed in images of violence, already isolated from her usual outlets, and now carrying a very personal, very digital grievance. The Cafesta comments were the match that lit it. After her arrest, Girl A was examined extensively by psychological evaluators. She was subsequently diagnosed with Asperger syndrome, what is now referred to as autism spectrum disorder. This detail matters, but it needs to be handled with care. Asperger syndrome is not a cause of violence. The vast majority of people on the autism spectrum never harm anyone, and it would be both wrong and harmful to suggest otherwise. But what the diagnosis pointed toward was a way of processing the social world that can make certain dynamics acutely painful, particularly the invisible social codes that neurotypical children navigate more intuitively. For someone who struggles to pass the unspoken grammar of social life, a public insult, one that's typed out in a chat room where others can see it, where it can be read and reread, can register not as passing rudeness, but as a verdict. Permanent. Official. Defining, it said that being called a buriko by someone she considered a friend felt, to Girl A, like a profound betrayal. Not a casual slight between schoolgirls. A condemnation, and the fact that it was written down, visible to others, shareable, permanent in the way that digital text is permanent, that may have given it a weight that a spoken word in a school hallway might not have carried. But the question of why she responded with lethal violence is one that no single factor answers. Most people who feel humiliated by a peer, including most people on the autism spectrum, do not kill. What happened here appears to have been a particular and terrible convergence, a growing pattern of escalating aggression that nobody fully intervened on, an academic pressure that removed her only healthy outlet, an immersion in violent themes, a trigger that felt, in her processing of it, like the final unforgivable betrayal. None of those things individually predicts murder. Together, in this particular child, in this particular moment, they produced one. What makes the Sasebo slashing distinct, even setting aside the age of the perpetrator, is how much of it lived in the digital world before it became physical. In 2004, social media as we now know it didn't exist. But there was Cafesta, there were personal websites, there were message boards, and children were using all of them to conduct their social lives in ways that adults barely understood yet. The conflict that ended Satomi Mitarai's life didn't erupt in a schoolyard or at lunch. It grew slowly and digitally in a chat room, in typed words that could be saved and revisited and shown to others. This is a particular cruelty that digital life introduced and that we still haven't fully grappled with. A spoken insult in a corridor fades with the day. A posted one doesn't. It lives on the screen. It can be read again at midnight, in the quiet of a bedroom, when there's no one around to put it in proportion. It accumulates. What happened after the murder entered another dimension of the digital world, one that nobody anticipated and that remains deeply uncomfortable to discuss. In the days following the crime, Japanese television broadcast a class photograph, and in it, viewers could see a girl wearing a sweatshirt from the University of Nevada, Reno. Users on 2 Channel, Japan's vast anonymous image board, the cultural precursor to later platforms, went to work analyzing the image. By June 18, 2004, they had identified a name. They began sharing it publicly, circumventing the legal protections designed to keep the juvenile offender anonymous. And then some of them began creating fan art. The girl became known as Nevada Tan, Tan being a playful, childlike version of the honorific Chan, often used affectionately. People drew illustrations of her, cute images, some of them deliberately smeared with blood, some of them showing her holding a box cutter. There were original artworks, tribute pages, forums dedicated to her. An 11-year-old who had just killed her classmate was being aestheticized, being turned into a Mo character, a figure of internet fandom. It's a dimension of this case that resists easy framing. It says something about the early internet's capacity for detachment, its ability to process even a child's murder through the lens of entertainment, of imagery, of fandom. Satomi Mitarai's death had barely had time to register before part of the internet had already converted the person who caused it into content. The family of a murdered 12-year-old had to contend not just with their loss, but with the fact that their daughter's killer was circulating as an internet figure. The case reignited a fierce debate in Japan about its age of criminal responsibility. It had already been lowered once, from 16 to 14, following the 1997 Kobe child murders perpetrated by a 14-year-old who called himself Sakakibara. Sasebo pushed the question further. What do you do when the perpetrator is younger than 14 and the crime is planned, targeted, and lethal? The rehabilitation model remained in place, but its adequacy was argued then, and is still argued now. On September 15, 2004, the Nagasaki Family Court ruled to send girl A to a juvenile reform facility in Tochigi Prefecture. Because she was 11 years old, criminal prosecution was never an option under Japanese law. The family court system, which operates on principles of rehabilitation rather than punishment, handled everything. The court handed down an initial 2-year commitment. In September 2006, following another round of psychological evaluation, that term was extended by an additional 2 years. In May 2008, authorities announced they would not seek any further extension. She was released. That timeline, 4 years in an institution, is not nothing. But for the family of Satomi Mitarai, who was 12 years old and should have grown up, 4 years doesn't map onto a life. After her release, very little is known publicly, which is by design. Japanese law strictly protects the privacy of rehabilitated juvenile offenders. Their records are sealed, their identities legally shielded. It's reported that in 2013, her family relocated to an undisclosed location so she could live under a new name. She was in her early 20s then. By now, she would be in her early 30s. What the Sasebo slashing leaves behind isn't just grief for a girl who should still be here. It leaves a series of questions we are still figuring out how to ask. What do we do when children commit crimes that an adult framework, prisons, trials, public records, was designed to address? Does rehabilitation work? For whom and on what timeline? And what happens when the social world moves online, when the words children say to each other are no longer private, no longer forgotten after the school day ends, no longer spoken only where adults might notice? What do we owe children who live their friendships and their conflicts in digital spaces where nothing disappears? These questions don't have clean answers. But Satomi Mitarai was 12. She deserved a future. Understanding how she lost it is the least we can do. Thank you for watching. If this case stays with you, if it makes you think about what it means that so much of childhood now happens on screens, subscribe and stay with us, because the cases that are hardest to understand are the ones we most need to.